Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you've shared and, well, really dig in to find the most interesting bits for you.
Exactly. We sift through the material and pull out the key insights.
And today, our focus is on a really intriguing dinosaur, Alxasaurus. We've got some solid scientific material here. Overview, discovery, its place in the family tree.
Yeah, good stuff covering the basics and more.
So, our mission, if you will, is to figure out what Alxasaurus is all about, where it fits in that huge dinosaur story, and why finding it was actually a big deal.
Precisely. We want to get beyond just listing facts and understand what Alxasaurus tells us about, well, the evolution of life itself.
Okay, let's start with a name then. Alxasaurus. Sounds like it has a story right from the get-go.
It really does. Alxasaurus basically means Alxa lizard. Simple enough, right?
Alxa lizard, okay.
The Alxa part, that comes from the Alxa Desert, some people call it the Alishan Desert in Inner Mongolia. That's the spot where they found the fossils.
Ah.
And Sauros, as you probably know, that's just Greek for lizard. Very common ending for dinosaur names.
Right.
What's kind of neat is that Alxa is also the name of the local administrative area, the Alxa League, so the name is really tied to the place.
So geographically specific.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And when did this Alxa lizard actually get discovered?
That happened back in 1988. It was during the China-Canada Dinosaur Project.
Oh, a joint project.
Yeah, a big collaboration. They were working in the Ban-Gobi Formation in Inner Mongolia, and they didn't just find like a single bone. They actually uncovered 5 different specimens.
5. Wow, 5 individuals. That must have provided a pretty decent look at the animal.
Oh, definitely. A much better picture than just one fossil. And they cataloged them carefully, of course.
Do we know the numbers?
Yeah.
Just for the record.
Yep. There's IVPP 88402. That one's interesting because it includes material from 2 individuals, and one of those is the holotype.
The main reference specimen, right.
Exactly. Then you've got IVP 88301, IVPP 8853, and IVP 8850, all found pretty close together.
And they took all these back to study.
That's right. Transported to Beijing to the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. Bring all the pieces back to the lab to put the puzzle together.
Makes sense. And every dinosaur needs a species name, too.
Huh.
What's the story with Alexitaensis?
Ah, Alexitaensis. That name honors a village, Alesitai. It was the village closest to the actual dig site where they found these Alxasaurus bones.
So again, tied directly to the location, genus, and species. Easy to remember where it came from.
Exactly. Keeps it grounded.
Now, the source material mentioned something interesting. While they were prepping these fossils, a paleontologist, Dong Ziming, noticed something.
Yes, that's right. Dong Ziming, a very famous Chinese paleontologist. He saw some really striking similarities between the Alxasaurus bones and another, well, frankly, quite weird dinosaur called Signosaurus.
Signosaurus, I know that one.
Yeah.
Part of that unusual group.
Exactly. And this observation was pretty important because back then, scientists were still scratching their heads about where these dinosaurs, the ones with long claws, kind of pot-bellied maybe, where they actually fit in.
So what did Dong notice specifically?
Well, the specifics aren't detailed right here, but the overall resemblance was strong enough that he and his Canadian colleague, Dale Russell, started thinking. Russell apparently saw what he called conclusive evidence, linking these Signosaurs, as they were known then, to theropods.
Ah, theropods. The meat eaters, mostly.
Mostly, yes. And this is where it gets really interesting, like you said.
Yeah.
Because it started to push back against the older ideas.
Okay, so before Alxasaurus came along, and Dong and Russell made these connections, what was the main theory about these Signosaurs, or Therizinosaurs?
Well, the thinking, though maybe not super strongly held, was that they might be some kind of late-surviving basal sauropodomorph.
Wait, like the long-necked plant eaters?
Yeah.
Like Diplodocus ancestors? That seems odd.
It does seem odd now, doesn't it? But remember, they had some weird features, potentially herbivorous diet, maybe a different posture. So Alxasaurus being relatively complete and showing these theropod links was a crucial piece of the puzzle.
So it strongly suggested they weren't sauropodomorphs at all.
Exactly. It pointed towards them being highly derived coelurosaurs. That's a major group within the theropods, the group that includes things like tyrannosaurs, raptors, and crucially birds.
Wow. So Alxasaurus basically helped rewrite their family history. A major evolutionary shift in understanding.
A really significant reclassification, yeah. Huge implications.
Okay, so Alxasaurus was pivotal. Let's dig into what it actually looked like. What do we know about its size, its build?
Right. So based on those 5 skeletons, we can estimate it was reasonably sized, maybe 3.8 to 4 meters long. That's about 12, 13 feet.
Okay, respectable.
Hip height, probably around 1.5 meters, so nearly 5 feet tall at the hips. And weight, estimates hover around 380 to 400 kilograms.
So roughly 840 to 880 pounds, maybe like a small horse or a large pig.
Something like that, yeah. Not enormous, but certainly not small either.
And the overall shape. Did it look like a typical theropod?
Well, yes and no. It already showed some key features that became really characteristic of the later, more specialized Therizinosaurs.
Such as?
Things like a relatively long neck, a tail that was shorter than you'd expect in many other theropods, and those quite noticeable claws on the hands.
Ah, the claws. Therizinosaurs are famous for those, aren't they?
They are. The Cenosaurus itself had ridiculously long ones. Alxasauruses weren't quite that extreme, but they were definitely there.
What can we tell about its specific claws from the fossils?
Okay, so the hand bones, the phalanges, were found disarticulated, jumbled up, but we do have the unguals, the actual bony cores of the claws. They're a bit crushed, unfortunately.
Jane.
Yeah, but we can see they seem to have been hollow towards the base, which is interesting. Shape-wise, maybe a bit like the claws of Dinocaris, another oddball dinosaur, but narrower.
So not like the giant scythes of Therizinosaurus.
Yeah. No, definitely smaller and probably less specialized. The thinking is they might have been used more for, say, pulling down branches or maybe defense, rather than the extreme raking suspected for Therizinosaurus, a more general-purpose tool, perhaps.
Okay. And diet. You mentioned maybe pulling down branches.
Right. The consensus now, based on Alxasaurus and its relatives, is that it was likely an herbivore, a plant eater.
A plant-eating theropod. Still feels a bit weird to say.
It does, but the evidence mounts up. The sources mention the probable presence of a beak inferred from relatives and likely a large gut needed to process plants.
Any direct evidence from the Alxasaurus fossils themselves? Like the skull?
We don't have the whole skull, but we do have a pretty decent right dentary that's the main bone in the lower jaw that holds the teeth. From the holotype IVPP 88402.
And what does that jaw tell us?
Well, the tooth-bearing edge is about 18.5 centimeters long, so roughly 7 inches. And it held quite a few teeth estimates, are around 40.
40 teeth. That sounds like a lot.
It is, actually. It's more than later the rhizinosaurids like Erlikosaurus or Signosaurus, maybe indicating it was still in an earlier phase of adapting to herbivory.
Interesting. Any details on the teeth themselves?
Yeah, the ones at the very front of the jaw had small serrations, denticles, on their front edge, about 8 to 10 of them.
Serrations usually mean meat eating, don't they?
Often, yes, but small denticles can also help shred plant matter. Plus, we also see signs of interdenticle plates, little bony plates between the teeth sockets, which are common in herbivores. Combine that with the likely beak at the front, it paints a picture of a plant processor.
Okay, makes sense. Lots of teeth, maybe some serrations for shredding, interdental plates, probably a beak. Got it. What about the rest of the skeleton? Anything stand out?
Let's see. The neck vertebrae, the cervicals, they're pretty poorly preserved, kind of crushed. But it looks like the main body of the vertebrae were amphiplachian.
Meaning flat on both ends.
Basically, yes. Relatively flat. And the neural spines, the bony projections on top, seem small and narrow. The back vertebrae, the dorsals, show how they lock together. The sacrum, where the spine fuses to the hips, is also crushed.
What about the tail? You said it was short.
Yeah, relatively short for a theropod. The tail vertebrae, the caudals, are fairly well preserved, though we're missing the very tip. But it's clear Alxasaurus had fewer tail vertebrae than many other theropods.
Any idea why? Does that affect how it moved?
It likely would have affected balance and agility compared to its longer-tailed cousins, yeah. Maybe less need for a counterbalance if it wasn't chasing prey, perhaps. Just speculation, though.
Fair enough. Okay, moving to the limbs, arms and legs.
The shoulder blade, the scapula, was long and quite slender. Arm bones are a bit flattened, making them tricky to study in detail. But the hand, as we said, is reasonably complete, even if jumbled.
And the hand bones showed similarities to Therizinosaurus.
Some, yes. The wrist bones, the carpals show similarities. The metacarpals, the main hand bones, also resemble Therizinosaurus, but are less robust, a bit more slender.
Any other details about the hand?
One interesting thing is these small pits for ligaments. They extend onto the inner sides of the finger bones. That actually links them more closely with Signosaurus than with Therizinosaurus.
Okay. So a mix of features. What about the legs and hips?
Right. The pelvis, The front part of the ilium, the main hip bone, and the pubis bone aren't preserved, but the back lower part of the ilium has this big crest, or maybe a roughened area. Paleontologists think that's probably homologous, meaning the same structure as a similar patch on Segnosaurus.
Okay.
And there are these two sort of strap-like bones that they tentatively identify as the ischia, another part of the pelvis pointing backwards.
And the leg itself, the femur.
The femur, the thigh bone, is slightly bowed outwards. That's actually different from Segnosaurus, which had a straight femur. The top end, the femoral head that fits into the hip socket, is angled upwards and inwards.
What about the feet?
Ugh. Feet are tricky. We don't have the ankle bones, the parsals. And identifying the individual foot bones, the pedal elements, is a bit dubious, according to the sources.
So not much detail there.
Not definitively.
Oh.
It looks like the third metatarsal, one of the long foot bones, was broad at the top, similar again to Segnosaurus. And the overall impression is that the foot was kind of short and wide.
Short and wide foot.
Yeah, which is interesting because it shows some convergence, sort of parallel evolution with the feet of some really early sauropodomorphs, those long-necked herbivores we mentioned earlier.
Huh. So even though it wasn't a sauropodomorph, its feet ended up looking a bit similar. Fascinating.
It is, isn't it? Shows how similar lifestyles can drive similar adaptations.
Okay, that's a ton of great anatomical detail. Let's pull back to the bigger picture again. The significance of Alxasaurus in theropod evolution. We touched on it, but let's reinforce why it was such a game changer.
Right. The key takeaway is that Alxasaurus, even though it's one of the earliest known members of its group, the Therizinosauridae, it already had many of the hallmark features.
Like the long neck, short tail, the claws.
Exactly. Seeing those traits already present relatively early on was really strong evidence that the Arizosaurs weren't holdover sauropodomorphs, but were definitely weird theropods, aberrant theropods, as the source says.
And closely related to other theropod groups.
Yes, specifically showing links to coelurosaurs, that group including troodontids, the brainy little guys and birds. It placed them firmly within that lineage.
And later fossil finds confirm this.
Absolutely. Discoveries like Bipiosaurus, which even had feathers preserved.
Right, the fezzy one.
Yeah, and Falcarius. These were even more basal, more primitive Therizinosaurs. And they showed even clearer links to typical theropod ancestors. They really helped solidify our understanding of how this group evolved from meat eaters into specialized herbivores.
So where does Alxasaurus sit in that evolutionary lineup now?
It's seen as being in an intermediate position. It's more derived, more advanced than Bipiosaurus and Falcarius. But it's more primitive, less specialized than the later family Therizinosauridae.
Which includes the famous ones.
Right. Alxasaurus, Segnosaurus, and the star of the show, Therizinosaurus itself. Alxasaurus sits nicely on the branch leading towards them.
A perfect transitional fossil, almost.
You could definitely see it that way, yeah. Shows the steps along the way.
Now, our source material also mentioned classification. Something about an Alxasauridae family.
Ah, yes. When Russell and Don described it in '93, they did propose a new family, Alxasauridae, just for Alxasaurus.
But that hasn't really caught on.
Not widely, no. Mainly because, well, it only contains Alxasaurus, and paleontologists generally prefer families to group multiple related genera together if possible. It's technically a valid name, but most researchers just place Alxasaurus within the broader Therizinosauridae group without needing a separate family for it.
Okay, makes sense. And the source included a cladogram, that evolutionary tree diagram, from 2019.
It did, yes. Hartman and colleagues, and it visually confirms what we've been talking about.
What does it show?
It shows Alxasaurus branching off after basal forms like Bipiosaurus, but before you get to the cluster of Therizinosauridae species like Alxasaurus and Therizinosaurus, it just lays out that intermediate position very clearly.
Like seeing it on the map of the family tree.
Exactly. It visually places it as a key step in the Therizinosaur evolution.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive into Alxasaurus, really fascinating creature. To kind of wrap things up, what are the absolute key things you want listeners to remember?
Okay, number one, Alxasaurus comes from the Alx Desert, Inner Mongolia, the name tells you that. Mid-sized dinosaur, maybe 4 meters long, probably a plant eater.
Got it. Discovery, size, diet.
And crucially, its discovery was a major piece of evidence showing that these weird Therizinosaurs were definitely theropods, closely related to birds, not some kind of leftover sauropodomorph.
So it helped solve a big evolutionary puzzle.
It really did. Alxasaurus is important because it's an early example showing that transitional body plan, the long neck, shorter tail, specialized hands, evolving within the Therizinosauridae. It gives us a fantastic snapshot of that evolutionary journey.
From meat-eater ancestors to specialized herbivores. Amazing.
It really is.
Thinking about this unique mix of features in Alxasaurus,
Hmm.
it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other incredible evolutionary stories, what other surprising transitions might still be locked away in the rocks, just waiting for us to find them?